For today's podcast, we're going to be going on the war on drugs. I'm going to explain an actual solution to it that will actually eliminate it and give people a solution that will be applicable, that will end up getting something that people will want, and it will show that it will work for many other things that people are looking at currently. And but first I wanted to ask people to think about becoming a patron at my Patreon page at patreon.com/challengehistory. Tiers start at $1 and go all the way up to $100 a month. The $1,500 months, when I get some people on there, there's going to be a benefit for the $50 a month will be a winner. Currently will be a silver Roman coin, and the $100 will be a Byzantine gold coin. This is going to be on the yearly allotment, and that would be a pretty cool thing to have within for someone that would be willing to donate on that. And it would just be at the point to where when I get a few people on each of those levels, then that's when I will start that point in there. Basically, once I get like about at least a few people on those donation levels, then I will start that. And then by the end of within 1 year time, I will give that. I will do the giveaway, and that will be for those people. For the other levels, I will eventually, as people start to add up with it, I will start to do giveaways for those as well. Now into the idea on the war on drugs. Now first, we need to look actually at one of the points that needs to be brought up first is the war on drugs constitutional? Now, most people tend to point to, well, we have a DEA. Well, this is usually the first argument that people say. Well, we have a DEA, so it must be constitutional. Well, that's technically not legitimate, because there's a lot of things that have gone through that are not technically constitutional, because the judicial branch showed executive deference and legislative deference to their respective branches, because they just didn't want to get in the way, and instead of actually doing what was constitutional in the first place. And this is what happens. And what they do is essentially they don't even look what's constitutional to begin with. And we've even seen the judicial branch even rewrite laws to essentially make things constitutional. So we can't necessarily count on them necessarily being a good guide to this. I mean, when we look at the ACA, they actually started rewriting that, and that's not their job. They should have been, if it came down to that point, they should have basically rejected that and said this cannot be done. You have to, this thing in 100% is not constitutional. Hand it right back to the legislature, and basically say we cannot allow this, regardless if the executive actually signed it, and even if it was after the point that one of the legislatures, that half the legislative body had flipped over to the GOP side, and then it didn't matter that if it couldn't get passed, they would have been SOL. Now, when it comes down to this, we need to understand is how the DEA got into how the war on drugs got started. Well, it was actually by a UN agenda. When these UN agendas get passed, so essentially it's nothing more than a treaty. Well, the fact is that does not necessarily mean that it is constitutional. Now, you can do a treaty with other countries or do it through the UN or whatever with it, as long as the Congress agrees to it, and then the president signs it. Well, that's just fine, but the fact is the basis of it cannot be violating individual rights. None of it can. And it can't do anything other than just be acting as a standalone treaty with other nations. It cannot do any other thing such as regulations or banning anything. It cannot act anything beyond those points. Those have to be individually signed into law themselves, if you're going to do so. Otherwise, they're not actually legitimate law, and they basically don't have any teeth. They're only basically guidelines, and that's the most that they could ever be. Such as, like, let's say if they were to sign, even if Congress were to sign the Paris Climate Accord, that would be no more than a guideline for the actual, if they were to sign that, because it went through the UN, what they were doing as an actual treaty, that would be no more than actually a suggestion to the companies within the United States. Now, if they were to actually sign the individual pieces into actually individual law, that would be a different case. Then those would actually be actual laws, and that would actually be constitutional. But otherwise, they would only have the teeth of being, only being an actual recommendation, and nothing more. And that's what needs to be understood. As they would act as nothing more than a treaty and recommendations. And that's the whole thing that needs to be understood. And no money could actually be given to other nations for any such activity without the consent of Congress, and it would have to be through appropriations bills. And this is the whole thing. They would have to be understood, and those would have to be separate. You could pledge it, but without the actual appropriation as a second act, it would not be. It would essentially be nothing but an idle promise. You could say you'll pledge $1 trillion to these other countries, but not until you appropriate that money is that money going to be appropriated through the actual act. They could promise that all day long. But the fact is that's why, when it comes down to it, that's the only act of a treaty. These are always separate. You cannot combine them together. Now, when it comes down to that's why you'll see the different things, as certain things are appropriation bills, certain things go down as treaties, certain things go down as actual laws regarding business conduct, and they're actually separated out, and you don't combine them together. And this is why when it comes down to it, we need to look actually at for the war on drugs. You can't just say, this UN agenda that was passed and signed that gave them the right to declare the DEA as an actual government agency is what's constitutional. Well, you can create the government agency, but that does not necessarily give them any legitimate right to enforce anything. You can create a bunch of government agencies, but they will not actually have any legitimate constitutional enforcement ability unless you actually find in some way that you pass an actual amendment to guarantee that. Such as you need, like they did with for alcohol prohibition, they did with the 18th Amendment, and that basically that is what gave them to ban a substance. This is essentially what allows you to ban a substance. Now, when we look for the other, we look for an amendment for banning any other substance other than alcohol there was ever done through amendment, we never see any. Thus, we know that drugs have never been banned. And this is this is, first of all, the argument why the war on drugs has to be ended. Number one is because it's not even constitutional. Because you see this right here with it, where Amendment 18 was actually enacted, but if you keep going down, you see since the point, you see that 19 was the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged in any state on the account of sex, basically women's right to vote. 20 is would be basically 20 is basically Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution was modified by Section 2 of this amendment. In addition, the portion of the 12th Amendment was superseded by Section 3, which we go up to the 12th Amendment, and that goes over that's basically going over a lot of the procedure of elections. So when we talk about that, that's really what we're talking about there. And and then we go to 21. It repeals that repealed the prohibition. We go to 22. That limited the number of times that a president could be elected to 2 times. Obviously, they could serve a 3rd time if they served as a VP, or if they served as a VP. They technically could serve up to 4 times, because they could serve VP before and serve VP after, but limited for where they could be elected twice. Uh, 23 is basically giving District of Columbia their own representative in Congress, but not letting them, but not considering them as a state, which does not give them any representation there in the area of the Senate, but in the House of Representatives. And they and basically going over the total number of electors will equal the same amount as the number of people as well. Then we go up to 24. That eliminates people the right to vote in any primary or any other election for president, vice president, for electors for president, vice president, senator, representative in Congress, shall not be denied a bridge to by the United States or any state by reason for failure to pay any poll tax or any other tax. So we keep going down. 25 basically gives the level of succession in the case of what happens if there's a death, and it keeps going down. 26 is basically sets the voting age at 18, and 27 was basically saying that any raises for compensation for elected representatives do not take place until after the next term take effect. So when we look at, there's nothing in there that states anything about a any banned substances. Now what people try to do is people try to talk about the emotional side of this opioid crisis. Well, it's not drugs like hydrocodone or oxycodone that are actually the culprits. That would be oxy or basically like Norco or Vicodin, as you probably know it as well. But for those two drugs, they're actually causing. This is what basically the Congress is going after, for making it harder to get prescriptions. And it's not prescription drugs that are the cause. So it's not pharmaceuticals that are really the cause. What's happening is you're finding that it's actually, and it's not even it's not really the case of those. What it is drugs like fentanyl that are actually hitting the streets. Now, these are not usually coming from our own country. These are actually coming from out of the country. And what we know about fentanyl is about 80 to 100 times stronger than morphine. Initially, fentanyl was, as they say right here in the DEA, it was developed for cancer patients and applied as a patch to the skin. Nowadays, it's basically it's usually injected, and really the only way it's used is basically pretty much in hospitals alone. It does not get made for actual prescriptions. So basically making it harder for people to get regular prescription medication to deal with pain management is completely illegitimate way to actually handle any type of crisis. They would actually be going on like this. Now what we need to do is we need to be looking at this thing from an actual economic point of view. Is what causes this stuff to actually happen? Well, when you start basically when we go back to the idea on the prohibition, you will find that the big thing of that was it caused people to consume a lot more alcohol, because it was essentially prohibited, and it caused the amount of alcohol consumption to go up because there was a taboo nature of it. Now this will cause a problem with it. Now when you add to that you're basically making people that are looking for pain relief, when you're making it very, very difficult for them to just basically get this basic need for pain relief out there, what's going to happen for actually legitimate pain relief in many areas of the country, and you've still essentially done the war on drugs for medicinal marijuana and recreational marijuana, which would be making it easier than medicinal for these people to get the things that they need, which that can actually work for eliminating pain. What you've done is essentially you force these people to go on the street to get these things which are coming in to the country from areas like Mexico. such as these things like coming into Mexico from Mexico, like fentanyl. Now, since they're not really bringing in, because the usage of these other states, Mexico and some of the other southern states, are not bringing in marijuana anymore, or not bringing in drugs like marijuana anymore, because it's not affordable. Basically things that are going to be stimulants are going to essentially raise the level of pain in one's body. So they're not going to be using things like cocaine, methamphetamine, or anything of that nature. This is causing people to essentially adopt to things like fentanyl, which are coming on the streets. Now, this essentially could be cut with something else, because we don't know. People know that they're not purchasing heroin. First of all, a lot of them do. So when they say on the DEA that they believe they're purchasing heroin, they know that they're not purchasing heroin. They know that they're purchasing fentanyl. But the fact is that's not the problem. The problem is they do not know how to dose it. These people don't know how to dose it because it is so much more potent, as we see the amount of potency, because it needs to essentially be highly diluted when it actually enters the body. But it doesn't matter if we're talking about fentanyl. Doesn't matter if we're talking about stuff like Dilaudid. It really doesn't matter, because the fact is when you get these ones that are basically nearly 100 times more potent than morphine, it's a very, very big thing. And when I had my back surgery, they had me on Dilaudid, and that's about the same potency as fentanyl. When I had they use when I've gone for pain clinics, when I've gone through for my back, when I've gone through the stuff to have to check on my initially they thought it was something with an ulcer in my stomach. When there was initially my liver, they basically what they were doing is they were doing upper GI, and they had to for one of the drugs to knock me out, they had to use fentanyl. And with this, so what it does is basically these are the people that know how to use it, and they're using proper dosages, and so they know how to work with it. And these are the only places to get it. These people handle it themselves, and they set the amounts within. These are usually computer set dosage machines, and that do it when they're actually on an auto dosage machine, where you can press a button to dose it out, or if it's going to be dosed out by an actual individual, it's going to essentially be put into the IV line. And that's a major point that needs to be made, is it's not just people can't just get an actual prescription for this. The only cases with it is maybe you might find some person that can actually, if they have cancer, still getting a prescription that'll be applied as a patch, but very few people do that anymore. Most often is a lot of people are going to the medicinal marijuana for pain relief when it comes to that, because of the high dangers of fentanyl, because fentanyl does cause a basic reduction in respiration. And especially if you're using it over a long period of time, it's not very healthy. In short periods of time, stuff like fentanyl, stuff like Dilaudid is fine, but if you're doing it over a long period of time, it can actually cause some serious damage. This is why even when you go into the hospital for a serious surgery like a spinal fusion like I did, they want to take you basically off those things, and they want to get you on something that's a lot less strong, and they want to put you on something that's in a pill form, such as a Norco, which is like a Vicodin, but it'll be a stronger Norco, a stronger like Vicodin. I was on basically 7.5 750s every 6 hours, which is quite heavy, but it's a lot healthier than actually being on Dilaudid. And it doesn't cause nearly the respiratory problems nor the reduced blood pressure that you would normally have on that could actually cause the issues like something like a fentanyl or something like Dilaudid could cause, because of just a massive amount that's coming into the system. And this is why we need to understand that if you want to end this stuff, you need to go understanding how, number one, how the idea of the taboo nature impacts the demand. The demand's going to go way through the roof where it needs to be. That's number one. Number two is you need to understand what the price. If you end the war on drugs and make all drugs legal, what's going to happen is you're still going to have the stuff in the pharmaceuticals are going to be remaining in pharmaceuticals. The stuff that crosses over, such as cocaine, such as these things like fentanyl, and they're going to think about fentanyl. Well, fentanyl's going to shut down, because the fact is they're going to say, well, people are going to say, okay, all the market share for the people that would normally go to the pain clinics are going to go back to using the normal drugs, because essentially you just basically released all those stipulations that you were making people crawl over, because you were basically saying we're going to send doctors to jail for doing their job, and then you're going to eliminate that. You're going to also eliminate the idea of all of these other drugs. So what's going to happen is going to be more. It's going to basically make it a lot more difficult for them to have this idea of the drugs traveling into the United States as well. So when it does travel, it's going to have to subprice anything in the United States. That means it's going to make the profit margin so thin that it will not be worth it. And what'll happen with it, just like what happened with for the most part marijuana traveling into the United States, is it's going to disappear. And this is what ended up happening when a lot of states legalized marijuana. Is what happened for the travel of marijuana across the border was it stopped. And this is not a fact from what our border guards did. This is a fact of what the actual legal system did, and did a mix of stop prosecuting and stops, meaning basically either A, made it legal, meaning either A, decriminalized, or B, actually legalized the actual drugs themselves, which means the actual price of the stuff went down, which meant that they couldn't make any money. Now, when you do this across the board, what's going to happen is you're probably going to find the same thing. Like, let's say we're talking about cocaine here. Now, cocaine is only going to have a specific market, because it's not going to have a market for people that would normally have been kind of pushed away from the pain care maintenance. And since they would no longer be on that market, this is where you get people that would be only looking for getting high from the stuff. Well, since that's a limited group, and since that's going to be a slightly higher priced drug, with the exception of the production of crack, which is kind of mixed usually down, it's going to be very, very limited for the actual market itself. And if you understand where the actual process comes from, it actually comes from a lot of these poor Colombian farmers who are actually trying to make money, and then they usually switch over to that. Well, when you eliminate this taboo, what's going to happen is the actual price is going to drop. Those farmers are going to say, hey, pay us, you have to at least pay us the same amount of money you're still paying us to make it worthwhile for us to do this. Otherwise, we're going back to farming. And this means that basically that those people that were normally making a lot of money in the sales of cocaine were probably not going to make the same amount that they used to make. And it's going to eventually, you're probably going to find drugs like cocaine just totally disappear. And it's going to be a fact of how cocaine has to be produced. And you'll find the same thing. You'll find the same thing with heroin. Anything that's basically it's only produced in a certain area that has to come very, very far, is you'll probably find that if that has to come very far, it's not going to basically last, because essentially there's too many lines of people holding it that basically want their piece of the pie, and that's this natural way that that production and distribution works. This is the same thing in regular business, and this is what would happen. And we would see that essentially no matter what the actual remaining demand for it would be, the price would end up falling because there wasn't the demand that it was before, because you've eliminated all of this. You've eliminated all of the benefits of the taboo nature, and you're no longer seizing product. When you're not seizing product, there's the actual lack of product is no longer there in the market. So this no longer happens. Now, since heroin's less of a problem in the United States than other things, and it hasn't really been a problem for a while. I mean, it used to be a problem about 20 years ago, and only in certain areas. But that was basically because of the massive influx from Afghanistan directly after the war. But since then, it's slowed down a great deal because it's spread out. I believe it's spread out across the world. And eventually, if you legalize drugs, what's going to happen is going to basically be where they're going to say, hey, it's not the actual price within the United States is going to be too low, and it's not worth it. And they know that right now is they have to compete with fentanyl currently, so that's why there isn't the actual amount of heroin out there on the streets that there is right now, because fentanyl can be shipped in directly from Mexico, and heroin has to come all the way from Afghanistan. And if you can look at a map and see the actual travel that it has to take, and the actual when you go from country to country, there's a lot of dangerous checkpoints that would actually block you. Now, when it comes down to going from a country that connects, all you have to do is break one of those checkpoints. That's it. When you have to go all halfway across the world to do this, there's a lot of things you have to do to get it across, or you have to make sure to see if you can't sneak it across in shipping, and that becomes very, very difficult, and even the cost of that is very problematic. And that's where the whole issue comes from. And when we're looking at the economics of it, is the idea should be to reduce the prices to the maximum amount. If you want people to not die from these drugs, that should be the actual goal, is look on the economic approach. And that's the way you're going to save people's lives. And focus on that, focus on treatment. Because you're not going to win on anything else. And that's the whole factor of what's going on. And when we look at on fentanyl only comes in the United States from the way you can get it naturally is going to be from an actual hospital, with exception of if you're an actual cancer patient. Now, either A, people are robbing cancer patients. I doubt that there's that many cancer patients that they can really rob, because a lot of cancer patients are opting for medicinal marijuana instead, which if there is an actual lot of fentanyl, that's not the actual place where they're getting it, which means that the idea of trying to police the actual opioids, that's not exactly the legitimate way to do it. Or B is basically what's happening is they're getting it from Mexico, which is all they have to do is cross one border. Not very hard, because you just have to find one spot in a huge long strip. This can be anywhere from California over into, I mean, if you take a little bit of a boat ride, you could basically try to get that over through Florida. I mean, we're talking that basically there's a huge strip. That's the whole length of the country. You can go anywhere from basically California to Florida, basically getting this stuff into the country. And that's basically where we're talking about. And that they can get this stuff into the country. And once they get it in, they can find out wherever they want to distribute the stuff to wherever they want to do, to whatever they want to do. And what we're talking about is, when we look at some of the other stuff, is amphetamines basically is those are basically they can be produced domestically with it, but a lot of that is from actual that's actually really from a cause of when cocaine was made illegal. Well, when you made cocaine illegal, guess what? You came up with methamphetamine coming into the country. Yes, you will have some other reasons why that came up with it, but the fact is that's really where it came from. Anytime where you find the so-called designer drugs coming in, those are basically a factor of like bath salts. Those are a factor of what happens is those are but bath salts really aren't even used anymore, but those are basically a factor of what happens when you do different things from blocking other drugs, and people basically keep up the idea of designer drugs. Depressants with it, from barbiturates, different things they refer to as bennies, such as like different things like Valium and stuff like that. I mean, these things are going to be out there within. They pretty much, for the most part, they're not abused on a massive scale to where they've become an actual legitimate crisis, and they're probably never going to be. Ecstasy or MDMA, basically it's hallucinogen. Basically, you're never going to find that to be, because they've even found that even with those, they're not even. This is even with tests. They've found that to be. Some of them could be completely placebo when they're being sold. So what it is basically is they think they're getting something real, but they're not. Fentanyl obviously is the opioid. We're talking flakka, which is not even in the act, which is really not even in the. It's similar to bath salts, but they call it a designer drug as well. But a lot of times that's not even in the country. GHB, which is another depressant, but people really don't use it. Heroin is basically not really being, as I said, it comes from across the actual country. Basically, the majority of the heroin is being produced is in Afghanistan, and this actually happened after the war in Afghanistan, essentially because of what we did. We essentially created an opening to where they essentially out there have become the largest producers, and because we actually are running a deliberate, ineffective war on the drugs, which means we could actually spray them with spray these plants with Roundup or something like that to kill these plants, but they said it would anger the actual people out there who are actually growing the plants for drugs. It would anger the Taliban and some of the other groups out there, and some of the other drug lords out there. and some of the terrorist organizations that they're linked to. So it shows that they're not really looking to actually end any drug transitions. So we have heroin right there, which basically that's not on a whole. Hydromorphone, which is that's gelated, pretty much that's only comes in the hospital. I say otherwise, if you're looking at that, basically is it basically it's highly potent, and it only comes from it basically only comes from hospitals, and you could possibly get that as they, I wonder if they state this, but yeah, but they're not stating here, but basically it's most likely coming from overseas. Inhalants, basically you're never going to eliminate that. That's from people being stupid. Ketamine, we just saw them actually release that for an actual for use as an actual antidepressant. Cat, which is from an actual evergreen shrub, I guess. Which, if you want people to be stupid, kratom, which is a stimulant that causes sedative effects. Okay, if people want to be kind of stupid with stuff, LSD, people don't really use it. Marijuana has basically it's never killed anyone, and it also has a great deal of medicinal effects. Methadone is usually used for actual basically it's used for getting people off other drugs, but it's usually not used in the idea of other forms of an actual drug. Methamphetamine, basically we get back to the amphetamines. Basically that's pretty much it's pretty much being made, and most of it's being shipped over, and it's pretty much the idea of that is it goes down to the idea of it's another stimulant. So it was basically adapted in this country because there was a huge war on cocaine, so they looked for an alternative, and methamphetamine pops in. Morphine is the as we went on with it, that's kind of another base drug for opioids. Opium, nobody uses it anymore. Oxycodone, that's OxyContin. That's pretty much that. Most people use that for pain relief. PCP, people don't use that. Really, within the rare cases, peyote and mescaline, that's basically, it's only used by like Indian groups for the most part. And psychedelic mushrooms, people very rarely use those with it. It has its own crowd, but that's about it. Rohypnol is basically and they say it's used by cocaine abusers to relieve side effects. It's basically a depressant and Benny with a generic name. Salvia divinorum. It's a psychoactive plant for the mint family, abused for its psychoactive effects. Spice K2, synthetic marijuana. Again, that's a designer drug, and that's basically because you've had a war on marijuana. Steroids, basically only because of the fact of what it is itself, and basically you're also going to have from the transgender community, from for people female to male, you're also going to have that being abused as well, because they're going to feel that the normal therapy is not being effective enough. U47700, that's another designer drug. and that's because that's another designer drug that's meant to it's synthetic opioid that goes in the same idea as well. And this is the thing, what we're talking about here is we go to the idea of when we get to designer drugs. Designer drugs are meant to actually be copycat drugs. This means what they did is they essentially removed one from the market and essentially an alternative jumped in. This is basic economics. When you try to limit the production one becomes too expensive, you're going to have people tend to go with the best case alternative, and this is what ends up happening. And you will find this all the time, and it's just basic economics. If they actually understood this, they would understand what happens, and you will actually have an economic alternative replacements, and this is what happens. That's all they are, and that's all what these designer drugs are. That's all what amphetamines and methamphetamine was for cocaine, and that's all what these different opioids are with it. They're basically, a lot of times they're basically just alternatives, and that's what basically the fentanyl, what they're calling the opioid crisis, which is really just a fentanyl crisis. And it's caused by this whole war on drugs. Now, solution, and the war on drugs. This will actually cut the actual price of the actual drugs on the street. Now, what happens is this will, number one, it will reduce the actual crime in the border and drugs coming across the border. Why? Because what we know with this is there's this actual certain cost that it retains to actually cross the stuff across the border, because each of these distributors and manufacturers want to ensure that for their risk that they're incurring, that they want to get money, and they want to get a fair amount of money at each level. Well, when you actually say at the end with it, there's only so much money we can get for this, it comes right back up, and they're going to say, well, what do we do? Well, a lot of those people don't want to take cuts, so they're going to say, okay, we're going to take our business elsewhere. We're going to go in another direction, and we're just not going to serve this community anymore because they're not going to pay us a fair price. And that's what happens. It ends up just drying up. And that's what ends up occurring, because they feel the market is not a viable market anymore. And that's really what ending the war on drugs does, because it makes it so it's not a viable market anymore, and then they go into another direction. And this is what ends up happening, because you dry up all their money, and it's the easily the best alternative, and they'll try to push their drugs elsewhere. It could be to another continent, to another country, or whatever. But they'll end up saying, okay, the United States is no longer a valid region for us to push our drugs at. We can't do this. This is not affordable. We would rather push it to another country that, even though we have to push it a little bit further, it basically makes it to where we can actually make an actual fair price to what we feel is actually a fair price for our product. And that's what ends up happening. So what they do is they pull their stuff from the market. This would be cocaine, this would be fentanyl, this would be all the stuff with it. Basically, you wouldn't be able to get cocaine anymore in the United States. So if they want to end the deaths by cocaine, the designer drugs would pop right off the market. You probably have methamphetamine drop right out, because you might have small communities of it to make up for the loss of cocaine because of the price, but it would be so small, it wouldn't even exist. It would be very, very limited in existence, and it would be so limited, it would be in such a small amount, because the fact is it would just be serving that small community of people who were trying to make up for the loss of cocaine in the region, and that it would be just for those ones that actually were interested alone without the actual taboo nature. And this would basically severely limit the amount of things out there. And since you're anytime you eliminate a taboo nature of something, it's going to eliminate the actual price of something. It's going to cut it down, and it and then for other aspects of it, you're talking then the people who are actually doing this are going to be open out there, and it's going to be a huge revenue for people to for the actual taxation as well, for people actually concerned about that. Now I think that's taxation is still too high as well. With I think that we can actually go down to an actual basic sense of a very very tiny consumption tax at each level, and to have just a basic function of a government, and we could do that. But that's kind of a discussion for another day. And but when it comes down to it, this would essentially, for those people that want revenue back in the government, you're essentially, by having the war on drugs, you're pushing away a lot of revenue, and you're charging yourself a lot of money. Think about how much the war on drugs costs per year. I mean, it costs billions upon billions of dollars. And then you're also taking billions of dollars of revenue out of the government for revenue. You're removing revenue from the government and from the economy, and you're actually costing the more money in actual cost for the actual war on drugs as well. Why not actually take the best benefit, eliminate the war on drugs, get your money for the actual government and taxation, and then it's a win-win. Otherwise, these people are not paying taxes, and they're basically making a lot more money. Cut their income, and bring in money for the revenue. I mean, it should be obvious for the government that it basically wants to take as much money as they possibly can. I mean, it makes perfect sense from their aspect. I mean, they seem to always love to take more money and describe it always as an investment instead of actually spending. And then everybody tends to win. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and make sure you check out my Patreon page. Make sure you share this all the way around, and I will see you guys later for a hopefully later, unless this comes up as my later post, but for a live stream. Bye, everyone.